Hello, welcome back to the module that deals with the pipeline processor design. So far we took our single cycle CPU and modified it to make it a pipeline processor. In that process we added some pipeline registers and moved some resources around so the things look a little bit easier to design. We didn't quite design a good pipeline processor. It really badly suffers from some common issues that are associated with pipeline hazards. Now, pipeline hazards stands for a collection of issues that pipeline processors encounter. When we talk about pipeline processors, the basic thing that differs between a pipeline processor and a single cycle processor is that we have multiple instructions in flight. In a single cycle processor, our instructions will really depend only on themselves. Every instruction completes and then the next instruction starts to execute. And there is no really dependency between them. In pipeline processors, there are multiple instructions that are simultaneously being executed. And if the results of one instruction affect the following instruction, then we have an issue. The following instruction cannot proceed. There are generally three types of hazards, so it is important to understand them because they have different solutions that will avoid running into those hazards. In general, why they're called hazards? Because, especially earlier on, it was not clear who was going to take care of these issues. They can be addressed by either a compiler or the pipeline processor designer, but somebody has to take care of these hazards. If nobody does, the processor doesn't work. Or even worse, works most of the time, but fails from time to time, and it's really difficult to find out when and why it fails. So as I said, there are three types of hazards that we can encounter, and those are structural hazards, data hazards, and control hazards. It is always a situation that prevents starting a new instruction while there is another instruction that is in flight. Structural hazards appear because of contention over a resource. In most modern processors, at least these that are not that complicated like the ones that we are designing in this class, we are rarely going to run into structural hazards. And the pipeline is designed to match the ISA, and ISA prevents the existence of these hazards. Then the second type are data hazards. Data hazards essentially exist because of the dependency between the instructions. So if there is one instruction that is in flight that is going to write the result into the register file, the result that the following instruction cannot really cannot work with the same operand that is before it gets written back into the register file. Otherwise, we will be working with an incorrect value. We're going to talk a little bit more about that just in a bit. And finally, there is a control hazard. The control hazards happen when we have branches. If the following instruction that is being executed in the pipeline is following a branch, so if there is a branch in the pipeline and there is another instruction after that, that next instruction may be invalid if the branch ends up being taken. So, let's talk about structural hazards in a bit more of a detail. The simplest type of a structural hazard that we already addressed in our design even of a single cycle CPU is the contention between incrementing the program counter and performing arithmetic operations and when addressing the memory. For example, we could have made a mistake and left out the PC+4 adder and said, let's use the ALU instead. So every time we would have to add PC plus 4 to our instruction, we would use the ALU. Well, we have an issue there, right? Every time we need to add 4 to a program counter, our ALU would not be available. So our processor would not work very well. It would first, in one cycle would add PC plus 4, and then in the next cycle would have to execute things. So it was a very natural decision, and we just went through that to have a dedicated adder that increments the program counter. So in general, structural hazards appear because two instructions in the pipeline compete for the same resource. There are two ways to address structural hazards. One is to stall, and that's what I've just described as a possible outcome for not having a PC plus 4 adder. Essentially, the next instruction would stall until the previous instruction is finished using that resource. Stall often means introducing no ops. We'll see that in a bit. Then a more common solution is to add more hardware to our pipeline such that all instructions can execute concurrently. So let's take a look at a fairly straightforward structural hazard that can exist because of the register file. So in RISC-V ISA, our instructions can access the register file 3 times. There are 2 operands to be read and 1 to be written. So our register file has to be able to support that. Otherwise, we would have a shortage of resources. So our register file is designed to have 2 read ports and a write port. There are, remember, 3 addresses that go into the input of the register file. There is another subtlety in there. In order to be able to complete all of the operations in a single cycle or in a pipeline processor, we made one assumption that the register file is fairly fast. So it is faster than many of the other units that we have in a processor. We can read the register file in 100 picoseconds, and we can also write to a register file in 100 picoseconds. We'll see that that's a convenient thing that allows us to both read and write the register file in the single cycle. But the key thing here is register file has to be designed to support 3 accesses per cycle simultaneously. Let's take a look at another type of a structural hazard that we may have. There may be a memory contention. So in pretty much every instruction needs to access the instruction memory. But some instructions need to read or write the data to the memory. And we said that we have this unified concept of a memory, that we are working with a stored program computer, so there should be just one memory. So every time there is a load or store, it is going to contend with every other instruction for the memory access. In this case, it is shown that if you have a load word during the memory access phase, another instruction that would perhaps be trying to read an instruction, if you just had one memory, this add immediate would have to stall and would have to wait until the load word is done if you just had one memory. So a solution to this is to have 2 memories. But then you just contradict yourself, or then don't we have just one memory? And what's the story about 2 memories? Well, we do have one main memory that lives in DRAM, but we generally have cache that is on our processor die, on our processor chip. And we're going to see that in just next module in a couple of lectures. Essentially, there are pieces there are chunks of memory on our processor chip that have copies of the instructions that have been copied from the main memory and copies of the data that has been copied from the main memory, with 2 separate ways to access it. So we don't have to contend for the main memory when we are fetching an instruction while another instruction is completing a read or a write. All right, so in summary, structural hazards can exist, but they are avoided typically by the hardware design that matches the ISA. So we'll look through all the instructions that are in the ISA, and we make sure that our hardware is provisioned to support all of these instructions during the depth of the pipeline, that can exist concurrently during the depth of a pipeline. So what we have seen is that our register file has to support whatever the ISA requires us to have for it, and that we need to have separate instruction and data memories, or at least copies of instruction and data memory, so we can access them separately. That's it for structural hazards. They're relatively straightforward to understand. The next ones are data hazards, which are a little bit trickier. See you in a bit.